Whenever the subject of chronology comes up, somebody brings up that using astronomy is the best, most accurate way of dating ancient events, if we would only put in the effort to make it work. But is that really true? Find out on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today, we are going to talk about archaeoastronomy. That is, astronomical events used for the purpose of discovering things about the past. And it is often said that archaeoastronomy promises to make chronology absolutely scientifically accurate if we were only willing to put in the effort to make it work. However, the trend among modern chronologists is to avoid astronomical methods in their daily work. How can astronomical methods be so accurate, so precise, and so intuitive, and yet modern chronologists avoid these methods? In this episode, we are going to step through a bunch of astronomical methods that have been suggested for use in chronology, and take a look at why chronologists may or may not want to use them. First, let us begin with solar eclipses. A solar eclipse happens when the moon travels across the face of the sun and casts a shadow on the earth. The occurrence of solar eclipses can be easily calculated going forward and going back in time, millennia. And this calculation can be resolved down to the exact place, time, and date. Now, this sounds very scientific, amazingly scientific. However, ancient observers who noted eclipses often did not differentiate between a 90% eclipse and a total eclipse, or even a partial eclipse. This has led to problems when trying to figure out exactly which eclipses are being referred to. For example, the eclipse of Myrcele II was either in 1312 or 1314 BC, and we don't know exactly which one it was because of that observational ambiguity. The modern reader also may not understand what an ancient writer is talking about in their original ancient context. As such, there has been a temptation to apply eclipse understandings to passages that may not be talking about eclipses at all. An important example of this is Joshua 10, verses 12 to 13. The so-called Joshua's Long Day. This text is frequently misinterpreted as being a solar eclipse, even though the passage is clearly using omen language. Now, the problem here for the modern reader is the modern reader doesn't understand omen language. It's not part of our culture, it's not part of our religion or society. We have no framework for dealing with omens. We have, however, framework for dealing with eclipses. So we tend to read Joshua 10, verses 12 to 13 in light of a Western reading instead of according to its original cultural context. And this leads to a misinterpretation and a misreading, and as a result, a misdating by applying a method that shouldn't apply to the text. Now, the fact is that solar eclipses are rarely recorded in ancient literature. And when they are recorded, the nature of that observation is often ambiguous or unclear, or is written down in such a way that it may not seem like a solar eclipse at all. So there's a lot of difficulty when dealing with ancient texts and trying to relate them to solar eclipses. Next, lunar eclipses. lunar eclipses occur more frequently than solar eclipses, and they can be calculated with the same precision as solar eclipses. The problem with lunar eclipses is that there are very few ancient records that record lunar eclipses. The earliest was during the first year of Nabonassar, circa 746 BC, and the next record of a lunar eclipse is in 412 BC during the siege of Syracuse. So, lunar eclipses are virtually useless for chronology, since ancient observers seem to have shown little interest in recording their occurrence. Phases of the moon. Ancient persons often recorded the phases of the moon, and with enough data, you could figure events down to the exact day and year. However, again, the problem is with the ancient observer. Unfortunately, lunar observations frequently contradict each other. And there are cases, for example, the lunar observations for the accession of Thutmose III, where the author of the ancient texts just filled in a random phase of the moon and did not care whether it was accurate or not. Peter de Mandelian stated of the Thutmose III observations, quote, "It is impossible to accept both dates as they stand without emendation," end quote. Now, this problem is not just restricted to ancient observers. It also happens among medieval observers. For example, the Islamic moon phase records that were used by Scaliger, and in turn Ussher, to support his chronology ended up throwing his chronology into doubt for over a century, with all parties ultimately throwing up their hands in resignation over what was clearly a bad set of data. So, we are faced with real problems when using lunar phase observations. More often than not, we are forced to pick and choose which are true observations and which ones have been fudged. And it is not always clear which observations are which. Overall, phases of the moon can help to support a proposed date when coupled with other historical data, but they are unreliable when used on their own. Next, the Venus observations. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, Enuma Anu Enlil tablet 63, is a record of the astronomical positions for Venus, and the tablet dates to the first millennium BC, and the contents of the record are believed to have been compiled during the reign of Ammisaduqa, fourth king after Hammurabi. The tablet gives the rise times of Venus and the first and last visibility on the horizon before and after sunrise and sunset in the form of lunar dates. This record was maintained for a period of 21 years. Now, you would think with all those observations that we would be able to nail these events down to the exact day and year. Unfortunately, there are many uncertainties about the interpretation of the record, and there are corruptions of the text probably caused by the copyists. For example, years 13 and 21 are not even physically possible. With so much ambiguity involved in the text, high, middle, low, and even ultra-low chronologies have all been proposed to fit the data offered by the tablet. So much for scientifically narrowing a date down to an exact year as promised. Unfortunately, the Venus observations really don't help chronologists. Next, stellar alignments. Now, a stellar alignment is when human beings placed some object on the ground, like a stone pillar or a stick, and then align that stick with some star or constellation in the sky. And stellar alignments are frequently mentioned, particularly when the conversation turns to stone circles or the pyramids. Unfortunately, even if one could make the case that stellar alignments were a thing in the ancient past, a dubious proposition at best. It is complete speculation as to what those alignments are actually pointing to or can actually tell you. Stellar alignments cannot give you calendar dates, and they have no inherent meaning of their own. You cannot say that this monument aligns once a year with the Big Dipper and know exactly what that alignment meant to the ancient observer. Moreover, almost all the objects that are used or have been identified as having been used with stellar alignments have no identifying markers as to what they're supposed to align with. For example, you go to Stonehenge, there's no marks on there that say, oh, this is supposed to align with Orion. So any alignments that are being done is complete guesswork. So the long and the short of it is that the identification of stellar alignments is pretty much useless to the modern chronologist. Finally, Sothic cycles. Sothic cycle dating was really popular among chronologists in the 1940s. It was seen as the holy grail that proved the Egyptian high chronology. Now, the Sothic cycle is the idea that once a year, the star Sirius, also called Sothis, appears on the horizon at dawn. And it appears on the horizon on a different day every year. So it travels through the entire calendar. And because it moves ever so slightly, it only returns to the same day once every 1461 Egyptian civil years or 1460 Julian years. Now, the Egyptians made several observations of Sothis appearing on the horizon. Now, from that information, you would think that it would be very easy to determine the year for any Sothic reading. However, the use of Sothic dating is plagued with difficulties. First, you need to know the exact latitude of the observation in order to determine the date of the heliacal rise of Sothis. Furthermore, we don't happen to know at what elevation the observations were taken, or the atmospheric conditions and the quality of the horizon. These factors can throw off a Sothic reading by years. Second, none of the astronomical observations happen to mention the reign of the king. So there's a lot of speculation as to which reign an observation belongs to. Third, we don't know if the observation is astronomical or calendrical. If it is the latter, the retrocalculation would be 2918 or 2920 years, not 1460 or 1461 years. We also don't know how the Sothic cycle relates to the Egyptian civil calendar. When they thought the cycle began, or when they thought it ended, or what the Egyptians thought the significance of the cycle even was. Fourth, most Sothic cycle readings were tied to the practice of medicine. This is a very important consideration. Medicine was deemed to be effective during certain astrological events. For medical practice, physicians would often fudge the astrological observation if it meant a patient took their medicine. That medical practice was involved in the observation adds another factor of unreliability to the measurement. Overall, Mark van der Meerop, in his discussion of chronology and dating, believed that the bulk of historians today would not consider it possible to put forward exact dates earlier than the 8th century BC, thus consigning Sothic cycle dating to the rubbish bin. In conclusion, we have looked at 6 methods that are often proposed for astronomical dating. These methods are plagued with limitations and problems that make them unsuitable for modern chronology. Modern astronomy promised exact precision and science, but only when the ancient observer was equally scientific with all the blessings and trinkets of our modern age. So then, if we cannot use astronomical methods to get better dates, it is not because we are not putting in enough effort, but because the data is inherently limited. So anyway, I hope you found that video informative. Thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed the video, and we will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.